The morning mist clung to Lake Erie like a shroud, broken only by the rhythmic splash of oars cutting through the calm waters. It was September 10th, 1813, and Commodore Oliver Hazard Perry stood at the bow of his flagship, the USS Lawrence, watching the horizon with the intensity of a hawk. The 28-year-old naval commander had spent months preparing for this moment, knowing that control of Lake Erie would determine the fate of the entire northwestern frontier. In the War of 1812, Perry's keen eyes detected the first signs of what would become one of the most decisive naval battles in American history. Through the lifting fog, the distinctive silhouettes of British warships emerged like ghosts materializing from another realm. The enemy fleet, commanded by Captain Robert Heriot Barclay of the Royal Navy, had finally accepted the challenge that Perry had been extending for weeks. Today, the two forces would clash in waters that had witnessed only peaceful commerce just 2 years earlier. The American Commodore turned to address his crew, his voice carrying across the deck with the authority of command. "Men, we fight not just for victory, but for the very soul of our young nation. The British have controlled these waters too long, choking off our supply lines and terrorizing our settlements. Today, we take back what is rightfully ours." The sailors, many of them seasoned veterans of merchant vessels pressed into military service, responded with a cheer that echoed across the water. Behind Perry's flagship followed a motley collection of vessels that represented the hastily assembled American Lake Erie Squadron. The USS Niagara, commanded by Master Commandant Jesse Elliott, served as the second largest ship in the fleet. Alongside these brigs sailed smaller vessels, the USS Caledonia, Ariel, Scorpion, Summers, Porcupine, Tigress, and Trip. Each ship carried men who had volunteered to serve their country in this remote theater of war. Far from the grand naval battles being fought on the Atlantic, the British fleet approaching from the northwest presented a formidable sight. Captain Barclay's flagship, HMS Detroit, led a squadron that included HMS Queen Charlotte, Lady Prevost, General Hunter, Little Belt, and Chippewa. These vessels carried not only British naval personnel, but also Canadian militia and Native American warriors who had allied with the Crown. The stakes of this confrontation extended far beyond mere naval supremacy. The outcome would influence the loyalty of indigenous tribes throughout the Great Lakes region and determine whether American forces could maintain their foothold in the Old Northwest Territory. According to historical accounts documented by the Naval History and Heritage Command, the build-up to this battle had been months in the making. Perry had arrived at Presque Isle, Pennsylvania, in March of 1813 with orders to construct and man a fleet capable of challenging British control of Lake Erie. Working with shipbuilder Noah Brown, Perry had overseen the construction of several vessels while simultaneously training crews, composed largely of inexperienced sailors, soldiers, and volunteers. The economic implications of controlling Lake Erie were staggering. British dominance of the lake had effectively cut American supply lines to the northwestern territories, leaving General William Henry Harrison's army struggling to maintain its positions. American settlements along the lake's southern shore lived in constant fear of British raids launched from Canadian bases. The psychological impact was equally significant. British naval supremacy had emboldened their Native American allies, while demoralizing American forces throughout the region. As the two fleets closed the distance between them, Perry could see the careful formation his opponents had adopted. Barclay, despite having fewer ships, possessed several advantages. His crews were more experienced. His vessels had been purpose-built for warfare rather than hastily converted, and his supply lines remained secure. However, the British captain faced his own challenges. His ships were undermanned due to the demands of other theaters, and his supplies of ammunition and provisions had been stretched thin by the ongoing war. The morning sun began to burn away, the last vestiges of fog revealing the full scope of the approaching confrontation. On both sides, drummers beat the call to quarters as sailors hurried to their battle stations. Gun crews checked their weapons one final time, Marines cleaned their muskets, and officers made final adjustments to their formations. The peaceful waters of Lake Erie were about to witness a clash that would reshape the balance of power. In North America, The wind picked up as the two fleets maneuvered into position, creating small whitecaps that reflected the morning sun like scattered diamonds. Commodore Perry studied his British counterparts through his spyglass, noting their professional formation and the confident way they handled their vessels. Captain Barclay had arranged his ships in a line of battle, with the powerful HMS Detroit at the center and the Queen Charlotte providing strong support. The British commander clearly intended to use his superior firepower and experienced crews to devastating effect. Perry made a crucial decision that would define the entire engagement. Rather than attempting to match the British formation ship for ship, he chose to concentrate his attack on the enemy's strongest vessels. The USS Lawrence would engage HMS Detroit directly, while the Niagara would target Queen Charlotte. This strategy required exceptional courage, as it meant his flagship would bear the brunt of the British assault, while other American vessels provided supporting fire. At approximately 11:45 in the morning, the first shots rang out across Lake Erie. The British opened the engagement with their long-range guns, sending iron balls whizzing through the American rigging. Perry ordered his ships to close the distance quickly, knowing that his carronades would be most effective at shorter range. The Lawrence surged forward, her crew working frantically to bring their guns to bear on the enemy flagship, the USS Detroit. Mounting 19 guns compared to Lawrence's 20, proved to be a formidable opponent. Captain Barclay had positioned his vessel to take maximum advantage of the wind, allowing him to maintain optimal firing angles while forcing the Americans to approach through a gauntlet of enemy fire. The British gunners, many of whom had served in the Napoleonic Wars, displayed the professional competence that had made the Royal Navy the terror of the seas. As the battle intensified, the smaller American vessels began to play increasingly important roles. The USS Scorpion, mounting only 2 guns, darted between the larger ships like a terrier harassing mastiffs. Her crew, composed entirely of volunteers from the local communities, fought with the desperate courage of men defending their homeland. The USS Ariel and USS Somers provided crucial support, their lighter armament proving effective against the British auxiliary vessels. The noise of battle became overwhelming. As dozens of cannons thundered simultaneously, the acrid smoke of gunpowder filled the air, making it difficult for commanders to assess the progress of the engagement. Sailors shouted orders above the din, while Marines in the fighting tops exchanged musket fire with their counterparts aboard enemy vessels. The deck of the Lawrence began to show the terrible toll of combat as British shot found its mark. With increasing frequency, Perry's flagship bore the brunt of the British assault, facing concentrated fire from both HMS Detroit and HMS Queen Charlotte. The American Commodore had raised a battle flag, bearing the dying words of Captain James Lawrence, "Don't give up the ship." This banner would become a symbol of American naval determination, but as the battle progressed, it seemed increasingly prophetic in a darker sense. The Lawrence's rigging was shot away. Her hull was holed in multiple places, and her crew was suffering heavy casualties. The USS Niagara, commanded by Master Commandant Jesse Elliott, found herself in a difficult position. Elliott had been ordered to engage the Queen Charlotte, but the wind and the positions of other vessels made it challenging to bring his guns to bear effectively. Historical accounts from the American Naval Institute would later debate Elliott's actions during this crucial phase of the battle, with some critics arguing that he failed to provide adequate support to Perry's embattled flagship. Captain Barclay, aboard HMS Detroit, demonstrated the tactical brilliance that had made British naval officers the most feared in the world. He coordinated his fleet's movements with precision, maximizing the effectiveness of his gunfire while minimizing his own losses. The British commander personally directed the fire of his flagship's main battery, adjusting the elevation and timing of each salvo to achieve maximum effect against the approaching American vessels. The smaller British vessels also played their part with professional competence. HMS Little Belt and HMS Chippewa worked in coordination to prevent American light vessels from flanking the British line. The Lady Prevost, despite her modest armament, provided crucial support to the British flagship and helped maintain the integrity of their formation. General Hunter, the smallest vessel in Barclay's fleet, demonstrated remarkable courage in engaging opponents that significantly outgunned her. As the battle reached its crescendo, both fleets had suffered significant damage. The Lawrence's situation had become desperate. With most of her guns out of action and her crew decimated, Perry faced a moment of crucial decision that would determine not only the outcome of this battle, but potentially the course of the entire war. The young Commodore looked across the smoke-filled waters at his second ship, the relatively undamaged Niagara, and made a choice that would echo through naval history. The deck of the USS Lawrence had become a scene of carnage that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. Blood mixed with seawater as the wounded cried out for assistance, while the dead lay sprawled beside their abandoned guns. Commodore Perry surveyed the devastation with the cold calculation of a professional warrior, knowing that sentiment had no place in the heat of battle. Of his original crew of 103 men, only 24 remained able to fight. The flagship's batteries were silent. Her rigging hung in tatters, and her hull bore the scars of countless British shot. Captain Barclay's HMS Detroit had also suffered terribly during the intense exchange. The British commander himself had been wounded multiple times, his left arm shattered by American grape shot, and his body bearing several other serious injuries. Despite his wounds, Barclay continued to direct his ship's fire with the cool professionalism that characterized the Royal Navy. The Detroit's crew, composed of experienced sailors and Canadian militia, fought with the determination of men who knew that defeat would mean the loss of British control over the Great Lakes. Perry faced the most critical decision of his career. The Lawrence was effectively out of action, but the battle was far from over. The USS Niagara remained relatively intact, her guns still capable of delivering devastating firepower. In a move that would become legendary in naval annals, Perry decided to transfer his flag to the Niagara and continue the fight from his second ship. This decision required not only extraordinary personal courage, but also tactical brilliance, as it meant abandoning his crippled flagship while under enemy fire. The Commodore's boat crew, led by his faithful coxswain, prepared for one of the most dangerous journeys in naval history. They would have to row across several hundred yards of open water, while British and American guns continued to thunder around them. The small boat would be exposed to enemy fire from multiple directions, with no protection except the confusion of battle and the providence that watches over brave men in desperate circumstances. As Perry's boat pulled away from the Lawrence, the British gunners on HMS Detroit spotted the movement and shifted their fire toward the small craft. Iron balls splashed into the water around the boat, sending up geysers that soaked the occupants. Grape shot whistled overhead while musket balls from the British Marines in the fighting tops peppered the water nearby. Perry stood upright in the stern of the boat, his battle flag streaming in the wind, presenting a target that the British could hardly miss. The journey to the Niagara took approximately 20 minutes, though it must have seemed like hours to the men in the boat. Perry's courage during this transfer became one of the most celebrated acts of the War of 1812, demonstrating the kind of leadership that inspired ordinary sailors to extraordinary acts of valor. The Commodore's calm demeanor under fire helped steady his boat crew, who rowed with mechanical precision despite the deadly missiles flying around them. Master Commandant Jesse Elliott, commanding the Niagara, watched his superiors approach with a mixture of admiration and apprehension. Elliott had been struggling to bring his ship into effective action, constrained by the wind and the positions of other vessels. Perry's arrival would change the tactical situation dramatically, bringing fresh leadership and a new perspective to the American assault. The transfer of command took place with remarkable efficiency. Considering the circumstances, once aboard the Niagara, Perry immediately began to assess the tactical situation. The British fleet, while successful in neutralizing the Lawrence, had also suffered significant damage. HMS Detroit bore the scars of prolonged combat, her rigging damaged and her crew depleted. Queen Charlotte had engaged other American vessels and showed signs of wear. Most importantly, the wind had shifted slightly, creating new opportunities for aggressive action. Perry's first order aboard the Niagara was to signal the other American vessels Too close with the enemy, the USS Caledonia, Ariel, Scorpion, Summers, Porcupine, Tigris, and Trip had been fighting gallantly, but without coordinated leadership. The Commodore's presence provided the unity of command that had been missing. During the first phase of the battle, his battle flag, now flying from the Niagara's masthead, served as a rallying point for the entire American fleet. The British fleet, meanwhile, was struggling with its own challenges. Captain Barclay's wounds had weakened his ability to command effectively, and his subordinates lacked the experience to adapt quickly to changing circumstances. The Detroit's crew was exhausted from prolonged combat, and ammunition was running low. The Queen Charlotte had suffered damage to her rigging that affected her maneuverability, while the smaller British vessels were hard-pressed to maintain their positions. In the line of battle, Perry ordered the Niagara to break through the British line, a maneuver that would bring his ship into close contact with multiple enemy vessels simultaneously. This aggressive tactic violated conventional naval wisdom, which favored maintaining formation and engaging enemies at longer range. However, the Commodore recognized that conventional tactics had failed to achieve decisive results. The American fleet needed a dramatic gesture to break the deadlock and achieve victory. The Niagara surged forward under full sail, her crew working frantically to prepare for close combat. Gun crews loaded their weapons with double shot, while Marines checked their muskets and prepared for potential boarding actions. The ship's surgeon prepared his instruments for the casualties that would inevitably result from the coming assault. Every man aboard understood that the next few minutes would determine the fate of the battle, and possibly the war itself. The USS Niagara bore down on the British line with the inexorable momentum of an avalanche. Commodore Perry had positioned his ship to pass between HMS Detroit and HMS Queen Charlotte, a maneuver that would expose the Niagara to devastating crossfire, but also allow her to rake both enemy vessels with her own guns. The young Commodore stood on his quarterdeck, his uniform torn and blackened by powder smoke, directing the approach with the precision of a master tactician. Captain Barclay, despite his wounds, recognized the danger of Perry's maneuver and attempted to adjust his formation. The British commander ordered his ships to close the gap, but the Detroit's damaged rigging made quick maneuvering impossible. The Queen Charlotte, under the command of Captain Robert Finnis, tried to provide support, but found herself constrained by the positions of other vessels and the shifting wind. The British line, which had maintained perfect formation during the first phase of the battle, began to show signs of strain. The Niagara's approach created a crisis moment for both fleets. Perry's ship would either achieve a decisive breakthrough or be destroyed by concentrated British fire. The American Commodore had calculated that his vessel's fresh crew and undamaged guns would give him the advantage in close combat, but success depended on precise timing and flawless execution. A single mistake in navigation or gunnery could result in disaster for the entire American fleet. As the Niagara closed to within pistol shot of the British line, Perry gave the order to open fire. The American ship's guns erupted in a simultaneous broadside that sent iron balls crashing into the hulls of both Detroit and Queen Charlotte. The devastating effect of the close-range fire was immediately apparent as British sailors fell at their guns and sections of enemy rigging collapsed onto the decks. The Niagara's carronades, loaded with grape shot, swept the British decks with deadly efficiency. The British response was swift and professional. Detroit's remaining guns replied with a broadside that sent shot crashing through the Niagara's hull and rigging. The Queen Charlotte added her fire, creating a deadly crossfire that would have destroyed a less well-built vessel. However, the American ship's construction and the courage of her crew allowed her to absorb the punishment and continue fighting. The sound of battle reached a crescendo as dozens of guns fired simultaneously in a confined space. Perry's breakthrough had an immediate effect on the morale of both fleets. The American vessels that had been fighting defensively suddenly found new energy and pressed their attacks with renewed vigor. The USS Caledonia moved to support the Niagara's assault, while the smaller vessels darted in to engage the British auxiliaries. The USS Scorpion, despite her modest armament, managed to position herself to rake the stern of HMS Little Belt, causing significant damage to the British vessel. The British fleet, which had dominated the first phase of the battle, suddenly found itself in a precarious position. The Detroit, already heavily damaged from her engagement with the Lawrence, now faced fresh American opponents with undamaged guns and full crews. Captain Barclay's wounds had weakened his ability to command, and his subordinates struggled to adapt to the rapidly changing tactical situation. The Queen Charlotte, under heavy fire from multiple American vessels, began to show signs of distress. HMS Queen Charlotte found herself in an increasingly desperate situation. Captain Finnis had been killed early in the engagement, and his replacement lacked the experience to handle the complex maneuvering required in close combat. The ship's crew, while brave and professional, was overwhelmed by the intensity of American fire from multiple directions. The vessel's rigging was shot away, her guns were being systematically silenced, and her casualties mounted rapidly. The smaller British vessels fought with characteristic Royal Navy courage despite being outnumbered and outgunned. HMS Little Belt, General Hunter, and Lady Prevost continued to engage their American opponents with professional competence, but they lacked the firepower to influence the outcome of the battle significantly. The Chippewa, the smallest vessel in Barclay's fleet, demonstrated remarkable courage in continuing to fight despite being heavily outgunned by her American opponents. Perry's tactical brilliance became increasingly apparent as the battle progressed. By concentrating his attack on the strongest British vessels, he had disrupted their ability to coordinate their fire and support each other. The American Commodore's decision to transfer his flag and continue fighting from the Niagara had transformed a potential defeat into a possible victory. His aggressive tactics, while risky, had caught the British off guard and created opportunities for decisive action. The wind, which had favored the British during the opening phases of the battle, began to shift in the Americans' favor. This change allowed Perry to maintain his aggressive positioning, while making it difficult for the British to extract themselves from the developing disaster. The Niagara's superior maneuverability, combined with her fresh crew and undamaged guns, gave her a significant advantage in the close-quarters combat that had developed. As the battle reached its climax, both fleets had suffered terrible casualties. The water around the engaged vessels was littered with debris from damaged ships, and the air was thick with smoke from dozens of guns firing continuously. The outcome of the engagement hung in the balance, with both commanders making desperate efforts to achieve victory. The next few minutes would determine whether American or British forces would control Lake Erie and influence the course of the entire war. The smoke of battle had become so thick that commanders on both sides struggled to assess the condition of their own vessels, let alone those of the enemy. The USS Niagara, now firmly engaged with multiple British ships, had transformed the character of the entire engagement. Commodore Perry's aggressive tactics had created a melee that favored the Americans' superior numbers and fresh crews. The disciplined British line of battle, which had dominated the opening phase of the conflict, had dissolved into a confused struggle for survival. Captain Barclay, bleeding from multiple wounds aboard HMS Detroit, made a desperate attempt to rally his fleet. The British commander, despite his injuries, continued to direct his ship's fire with the professional competence that had made him one of the Royal Navy's most respected officers. However, the Detroit's condition was becoming increasingly precarious. Her crew had been decimated by American fire, her guns were being systematically silenced, and her hull showed signs of taking on water from multiple hits below the waterline. The HMS Queen Charlotte, now under the command of Lieutenant Robert Irvine following Captain Finnis's death, attempted to provide support to the flagship. However, Irvine lacked the experience to handle the complex tactical situation that had developed. The Queen Charlotte's crew, while maintaining their professional discipline, was overwhelmed by fire from multiple American vessels. The ship's rigging had been shot away, severely limiting her maneuverability and making it impossible to maintain proper formation. Perry, standing on the Niagara's quarterdeck, sensed that the moment of decision had arrived. The British fleet, while still dangerous, was showing clear signs of distress. the American Commodore ordered his remaining vessels to close with the enemy and press their advantage. This signal was received with enthusiasm by the American crews, who had watched their flagship Lawrence suffer terribly during the opening phase of the battle. The time for revenge had come. The USS Caledonia, under the command of Lieutenant Daniel Turner, positioned herself to rake the stern of HMS Detroit with devastating effect. Turner, a veteran of previous naval engagements, demonstrated exceptional skill in maneuvering his vessel through the confused battle line. The Caledonia's guns, loaded with grape shot, swept the Detroit's deck with deadly precision, causing terrible casualties among the British crew and effectively silencing several of the enemy's remaining guns. The smaller American vessels, inspired by Perry's example, pressed their attacks with unprecedented aggressiveness. The USS Scorpion, Ariel, Summers, Porcupine, Tigress, and Trip had been fighting gallantly throughout the engagement, but now they sensed victory within their grasp. These vessels, manned largely by volunteers from the local communities, fought with the desperate courage of men defending their homeland against foreign invasion. According to historical records preserved by the Great Lakes Historical Society, the battle had lasted for over 3 hours when the decisive moment finally arrived. HMS Detroit, battered beyond repair and with most of her crew dead or wounded, began to show signs of surrender. Captain Barclay, despite his wounds and the hopeless situation of his ship, maintained his resolve to the end. The British commander had done everything possible to achieve victory, but the combination of American numbers and Perry's tactical brilliance had proven overwhelming. The Queen Charlotte, seeing the Detroit's distress, attempted to provide support, but found herself unable to maneuver effectively. Lieutenant Irvine, facing impossible odds, made the difficult decision to strike his colors rather than sacrifice his remaining crew. In a hopeless cause, the sight of the British ensign coming down from the Queen Charlotte's masthead sent a cheer through the American fleet that could be heard above the roar of the guns. Captain Barclay, observing the surrender of his consort, recognized that continued resistance would serve no purpose except to cause unnecessary casualties. Among his brave crew, the Detroit's condition was hopeless. With her hull holed in multiple places and her batteries silenced, the British commander, with tears in his eyes, ordered his colors struck. The surrender of the British flagship marked the effective end of organized resistance on Lake Erie. The smaller British vessels, seeing their flagship and principal consort surrender, found their positions untenable. HMS Little Belt, General Hunter, Lady Prevost, and Chippewa had fought with characteristic Royal Navy courage, but they lacked the firepower to continue the battle alone. One by one, these vessels struck their colors, bringing the engagement to a close after more than 3 hours of intense combat. Perry's victory was complete and decisive. The American fleet had captured the entire British squadron, achieving a feat that was almost unprecedented in naval warfare. The young Commodore had not only defeated his opponents, but had taken every enemy vessel as a prize. This total victory would have strategic implications that extended far beyond the immediate tactical success on Lake Erie. The human cost of the battle was staggering on both sides. The USS Lawrence had suffered 83 casualties out of her crew of 103, making her one of the most heavily damaged vessels to survive a naval engagement. The British losses were equally severe, with HMS Detroit and Queen Charlotte bearing the brunt of the casualties. Captain Barclay's wounds would leave him partially disabled for the rest of his life, though his courage during the battle earned him the respect of both his enemies and his countrymen. As the smoke cleared and the guns fell silent, the magnitude of the American victory became apparent. Perry had achieved what many had thought impossible: complete control of Lake Erie. The British fleet that had dominated these waters for months lay captured or destroyed, their crews prisoners of war. The strategic implications of this victory would soon become clear. As American forces prepared to exploit their new naval supremacy, the waters of Lake Erie, which had echoed with the thunder of battle for over 3 hours, now lay eerily quiet, except for the cries of the wounded and the creaking of damaged vessels. Commodore Perry stood on the deck of the USS Niagara, surveying the scene of his triumph with a mixture of satisfaction And somber reflection, the complete capture of the British fleet represented a victory of almost unprecedented magnitude in naval warfare. But the cost had been terrible for both sides. The USS Lawrence, Perry's original flagship, presented a heartbreaking sight as she drifted helplessly with the current. Her mainmast had been shot away, her hull was riddled with holes, and her deck bore the stains of the blood shed by her heroic crew. Of the 103 men who had sailed into battle aboard the Lawrence, only 24 remained uninjured. The vessel's survival was a testament to both American shipbuilding and the courage of her crew, but her condition illustrated the savage intensity of the engagement. Captain Robert Heriot Barclay, badly wounded aboard the captured HMS Detroit, maintained his dignity despite the pain of his injuries and the bitterness of defeat. The British commander had fought with professional competence and personal courage, but he had been overwhelmed by superior American numbers and Perry's tactical brilliance. Barclay's conduct during the battle earned him the respect of his captors, and Perry ensured that the wounded British officer received the best possible medical care. The captured British vessels told the story of the battle's intensity. HMS Detroit bore the scars of prolonged combat, her hull punctured by dozens of American shot and her rigging hanging in tatters. The Queen Charlotte showed similar damage, with her deck littered with debris from her destroyed guns and rigging. The smaller British vessels, while less heavily damaged, had also suffered significant casualties and material losses during the engagement. Perry's first priority after the battle was caring for the wounded from both fleets. The American Commodore established a temporary hospital on Put-in-Bay, where British and American wounded received equal treatment. This humanitarian gesture reflected the professional respect that existed between opposing naval officers. Even in the midst of a bitter war, the medical facilities were primitive by modern standards, but the dedication of the surgeons and their assistants saved many lives that might otherwise have been lost. The strategic implications of the victory began to emerge even before the wounded had been properly cared for. Control of Lake Erie meant that American forces could now supply General William Henry Harrison's army in the Northwest Territory. Without British interference, the captured British vessels could be incorporated into the American fleet, providing additional naval strength for future operations. Most importantly, the victory would encourage American Indian tribes to abandon their alliance with the British and seek accommodation with the United States. Perry's famous dispatch to General Harrison, written in pencil on the back of an old envelope, captured the magnitude of the victory in simple, powerful words: "We have met the enemy, and they are ours. 2 ships, 2 brigs, 1 schooner, and 1 sloop." This message, transmitted throughout the United States within days of the battle, helped restore American morale after a series of military setbacks and demonstrated that American naval forces could defeat the vaunted Royal Navy under the right circumstances. The British defeat on Lake Erie had immediate consequences for their strategic position. In the Great Lakes region, General Henry Proctor, commanding British forces in the Detroit area, found his supply lines completely severed and his position untenable. The loss of naval support meant that British forces could no longer maintain their forward positions, and a general retreat became necessary. This withdrawal would expose Britain's Indian allies to American retaliation and effectively end the threat to American settlements in the Old Northwest. The captured British officers, following the customs of 18th and 19th century warfare, were treated with the courtesy due to brave enemies. Captain Barclay, despite his wounds, was invited to dine with Perry and his officers, where the conversation focused on professional naval matters rather than the political issues that had led to war. This civilized behavior reflected the mutual respect that existed between professional naval officers, regardless of nationality. The American victory had profound implications for the War of 1812 as a whole. British strategy had depended heavily on maintaining control of the Great Lakes to threaten American territory and coordinate with Indian allies. The loss of Lake Erie broke this strategic chain and forced the British to adopt a more defensive posture. The victory also demonstrated that American forces could achieve success when properly led and equipped, encouraging greater support for the war effort. The psychological impact of the victory extended far beyond its strategic significance. Americans had endured a series of military defeats and embarrassments during the early phases of the war, leading many to question whether the United States could successfully challenge British power. Perry's victory provided proof that American courage and determination could overcome even the most professional opponents. When combined with sound leadership and adequate resources, the treatment of prisoners after the battle reflected the professional standards of the age. British officers were paroled on their word of honor not to serve again until properly exchanged, while enlisted men were held in reasonably comfortable conditions. Perry's magnanimous treatment of his defeated enemies earned him praise from both American and British sources and demonstrated that victory could be achieved without sacrificing honor or humanity. The autumn of 1813 brought profound changes to the strategic landscape of the Great Lakes region, all flowing from those decisive hours on Lake Erie. General William Henry Harrison, no longer constrained by British naval dominance, launched an aggressive campaign that would culminate in the Battle of the Thames and the death of the famous Shawnee leader Tecumseh. The naval victory that Perry had achieved with such courage and tactical brilliance had opened the door to American expansion and permanently altered the balance of power in the Northwest Territory. The captured British vessels were quickly incorporated into the American Lake Erie Squadron, providing Commodore Perry with the strongest naval force ever assembled on the Great Lakes. The HMS Detroit, renamed USS Detroit, underwent extensive repairs and continued to serve under American colors. The Queen Charlotte, similarly rechristened, joined her former adversary in patrolling waters that had once been a British lake. These vessels, along with their experienced crews, gave the United States undisputed control of Lake Erie for the remainder of the war. Captain Robert Heriot Barclay, after recovering from his wounds, faced a court-martial to investigate the loss of his fleet. The proceedings, conducted according to Royal Navy tradition, ultimately vindicated the British commander's conduct during the battle. The court found that Barclay had fought with courage and professional competence, but had been overwhelmed by superior American numbers and resources. The captain's reputation survived intact, and he continued to serve with distinction in the Royal Navy for many years after the war. The political ramifications of the victory extended far beyond the immediate military consequences. News of Perry's triumph reached Washington just as American diplomats were beginning negotiations with British representatives in Europe. The victory strengthened the American negotiating position significantly, demonstrating that the United States could achieve military success against British forces. The psychological advantage would prove crucial in securing favorable terms. In the eventual peace settlement, the impact on American-Indian relations was equally profound and far more tragic. The destruction of British naval power on Lake Erie left tribes who had allied with the Crown without effective support in their struggle against American expansion. The death of Tecumseh at the Battle of the Thames, which became possible only because of Perry's naval victory, marked the end of organized Indian resistance in the Old Northwest. The consequences of this collapse would reverberate through indigenous communities for generations. Perry's achievement earned him national fame and political influence that would last for the rest of his life. The young Commodore became a hero to the American people, celebrated in newspapers, songs, and popular literature. His famous battle flag, bearing the words "Don't give up the ship," became an enduring symbol of American naval courage and determination. The victory on Lake Erie established Perry as one of the most celebrated naval commanders in American history, ranking alongside John Paul Jones and Stephen Decatur. The technological and tactical lessons of the battle influenced naval development for decades to come. Perry's aggressive tactics, particularly his decision to break the British line with the Niagara, became a subject of study in naval academies worldwide. The effectiveness of American-built vessels against their British counterparts demonstrated that the United States had developed significant shipbuilding capabilities. The battle also highlighted the importance of unified command and aggressive leadership in naval warfare. The economic consequences of American control of Lake Erie were immediate and substantial. Trade routes that had been disrupted by British naval activity reopened, allowing American merchants to resume commerce with settlements throughout the Great Lakes region. The security provided by naval dominance encouraged immigration to the Northwest Territory, accelerating the development of what would become the American Midwest. The victory also demonstrated the strategic importance of inland naval forces, leading to increased investment in Great Lakes shipbuilding and naval facilities. The memory of the Battle of Lake Erie has been preserved through numerous monuments, museums, and historical sites throughout the Great Lakes region. Perry's Victory and International Peace Memorial, located on South Bass Island in Lake Erie, stands as a testament to both the American victory and the peaceful relations that eventually developed between the United States and Britain. The memorial serves as a reminder that former enemies can become close allies when guided by mutual respect and common interests. The battle's place in American naval tradition cannot be overstated. Perry's victory demonstrated that American naval forces could achieve success against the world's most powerful navy when properly led and equipped. The engagement became a source of inspiration for future generations of American naval officers who studied Perry's tactics and emulated his aggressive spirit. The tradition of American naval excellence that began with John Paul Jones found its finest expression in the smoke and thunder of Lake Erie. The international recognition of American naval capabilities that followed the victory had lasting diplomatic significance. European powers, who had previously dismissed American naval forces as insignificant, began to view the United States as a serious maritime power. This recognition would prove crucial in establishing American credibility in international affairs and securing respect for American commercial interests worldwide. The victory on Lake Erie marked the beginning of America's emergence as a major naval power, a process that would continue throughout the 19th century. The human cost of the battle, while necessary for achieving strategic objectives, remained a sobering reminder of war's terrible price. The families of the men who died on both sides paid the ultimate sacrifice for their nation's ambitions. The wounded, both British and American, bore the scars of battle for the rest of their lives. Their courage and sacrifice, regardless of nationality, deserved recognition and honor from succeeding generations who benefited from their service. Today, the Battle of Lake Erie stands as one of the most complete and decisive naval victories in American history. Commodore Oliver Hazard Perry's achievement in capturing an entire enemy fleet demonstrated the importance of bold leadership, tactical innovation, and national determination. The victory changed the course of the War of 1812, secured American control of the Great Lakes, and established the United States as a credible naval power. The thunder of those guns on September 10, 1813, echoed far beyond Lake Erie, shaping the destiny of a young nation and proving that American courage could triumph over any adversary when guided by competent leadership and unwavering determination. The legacy of that September morning continues to inspire American naval officers and serves as a reminder that decisive action, even in the face of overwhelming odds, can achieve results that change the course of history. Perry's victory stands as proof that the American spirit, when properly channeled and courageously led, remains capable of achieving the impossible. The waters of Lake Erie, once stained with the blood of brave men from both nations, now reflect the peaceful skies of a continent where former enemies have become the closest of allies. A transformation that began with the courage displayed on that distant September day, when the fate of nations hung in the balance and American determination proved stronger than British steel.